Hi BookTube, it's Amy. So I was on YouTube this morning, not the BookTube side of YouTube, but the other side of YouTube where all the other videos live. And I was watching some fashion, some clothing related videos, specifically a few with titles along the lines of 5 purchases I regret making, 10 purchases I regret making in my early 20s. And don't get me wrong, I have had a lot of pieces of clothing in my closet that I later regret buying. But I got to thinking about my books, about the books that have come and gone from my library, and about some of the books that are still in my personal library that I really do regret buying. And one of them is a small error that I made last year in April of 2020. And that's the book sitting here on the table behind me. And this is a little J.M. Barrie volume. I have a mid-sized collection of J.M. Barrie books, most of them about 100 years old, so early printings of his. But this was not one that I was too pleased to add to my collection. It looked better online, it looked in better condition online. But by the time you spend the $30 that it costs to buy the book and have it shipped to Canada, there's really a disincentive to spend the cost of shipping to send things back to return them. Because this book was $10 US plus around 15 or 20 US dollars in shipping. Convert that over into Canadian, and I spent 30 to 40 Canadian dollars on this little book. A little book that I would have been happy to add to my collection if it had been in better condition, and if it had been a little bit bigger. And this is a regret because it showed up, and as you can see, the cover's a little bit dirty, a little bit faded. The blue color has run a bit, and it's quite a small book. It's really no bigger than the size of my hand. And this is partly on me for not reading the measurements of the description well enough. And I think it's sort of a lesson in not getting carried away and buying things without reading the full description and without seeing adequate pictures. A lesson in also understanding that when you buy a used book online, it's most likely that the seller has put the book in the best lighting possible. So this book was lit up in its seller supplied images in such a way that I didn't notice this running of the color here, and that I didn't notice the slight bubbling on the back here. And don't get me wrong, it's lovely to have another copy of A Window and Thrums in my collection, but I do regret spending so much on such a small book that's not really in the best condition. And that is one of the major categories of purchases that I've come to regret. Buying a book that was more expensive than I feel its condition warranted. But because it's J.M. Barrie, and because I spent so much, it has remained on my shelf with my J.M. Barrie collection. And I've certainly spent less on editions of J.M. Barrie that are much nicer than this one. So that is one category of my regrets, and one specific regret. But there are other categories of regrets that I have when it comes to book buying. Another one of my purchases that I came to regret was buying a copy of the book Duck's Newburyport, which was all the rage here on BookTube about 2 years ago. I think it was like fall of 2019 when I was reading that one, and I'm gonna be honest, I bought it based on a few other booktubers who had been talking about it, and based on the idea that it was this unique and difficult book to read. So I'm going to call this a hype purchase, a book that I purchased because everybody was reading it, and I really should have known that it perhaps wouldn't be my thing, because I'm not usually one for the experimental kind of writing. I do tend to like a much more traditional style of novel. But I really should have known that it wouldn't be something I would appreciate, and I should have saved my time and my money, because I got 300 pages into that book and the novelty was gone, and I came to absolutely despise the book, and I discarded it with much distaste in a little free library. So that was another regretful purchase that I made when it comes to my books. And then there is the vanity category of purchases. And I used to be much more guilty of this than I am nowadays, but by vanity, I'm talking about vanity editions. Editions that are, in essence, cheap and poorly made, but they look semi-nice on the shelf from a distance. So these are those cheap, faux leather-bound classics. Think Barnes & Noble's leather-bound classics. And I did actually own a few of those once when I was down in the States. Down in New York State, I went into a Barnes & Noble, and I think it was Dante's Inferno and Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina that I picked up in those vanity editions. And I never read them because, despite the fact that they looked somewhat pretty on a shelf, they were bulky, the font wasn't great, and they were just impractical to read. And so I regretted those. They hung around on my shelves for 5 to 6 years before I finally discarded them. And now I don't buy vanity books like that. I don't buy those cheap leather-bound books. A book may look pretty in the bookstore, but you really have to hold it and open it up and see if it's just going to look pretty on your shelf or whether it's something you can actually read. And I've also been guilty of vanity purchases when it comes to older books as well. There have been times when I see, something from 1890, something from 1850, nicely leather bound, very, very pretty, and I have no idea what it is, but I pick it up and I buy it regardless of the cost, because I'm so intrigued by how pretty it looks, and I'm intrigued with the idea of putting this pretty book on my shelf. And to be honest, most of those purchases I do come to regret, because although it looks nice and you get that endorphin rush from picking up that old book and purchasing that old book, when it comes down to it, the content don't always live up to the expectations, and it ends up being a dead weight on the shelf. Something that I look at and think, oh, I should read that. Oh, I should try to read that again. And it sits there and it sits there until I finally decide I have to get rid of it to make space for the books that I actually do want to read. And this sort of seeps into the fourth kind of book buying regret that I have. And this is getting enthusiastic about a classic author that I think I'm going to like without actually confirming for myself that I like this author first. Sir Walter Scott is the prime example of this. Last year, I was watching BookTube. I heard someone talking about Sir Walter Scott, about how great his novels were, about how he wrote these sweeping historical romances, about how he was one of the best writers of his era, and thought to myself, well, I've never read Sir Walter Scott. I should really read some Sir Walter Scott. He's well renowned, people like him, of course I'm going to like him. And I go online, go to the AbeBooks site, start looking for Sir Walter Scott, and I find these beautiful editions from the early 1900s, from about 1900 to 1915, these cloth-bound books in brown that are going to look absolutely wonderful on the shelf, gold gilded text on them on the spine, and I think, I'll just buy these up. They're not too expensive, 10 to 20 US dollars each, plus the shipping, and I bought 3 or 4 of them, thinking this is going to be the next big thing. This is going to be my next rabbit hole. I am going to love these. And the first one arrives and I get all cozy in my chair in the corner. I make a cup of tea, I sit down to read, and I don't like them. And I still have more on the way. I don't like the book, and I think, okay, maybe this one just isn't a good one. Maybe it's not for me. So I pick up the second one when it arrives, and I don't like it either. And I realize that the writing of Sir Walter Scott is not for me. It's just not something I'm going to enjoy. And here I am with 4 beautiful books that I don't want to read, that become a purchase that I regret, because I could have spent that $40 to $50 that I spent on those books. Or maybe it was more like 60. That $60 that I spent on those 4 books, I could have spent that money on books that I would actually enjoy and actually want to read. And it comes down to impulse buys. Most of these book buying regrets have to do with the impulse of purchasing and grabbing without really thinking about what I'm actually going to want to be reading. It goes with, the hype or the impulse of seeing somebody talking about a book and hitting click and order immediately, or the impulse of seeing something beautiful in a shop and purchasing it without thinking about it. And all these regrets have mainly, as I said, been from the spur of the moment. They're not things that I had been thinking about for a while. They're not books that I had on a TBR wanting to read forever. They're just, oh, that sounds interesting. Let's purchase that right now and have it arrive next week, or let's take it home today. And then it ends up on the shelf and I've lost interest in it, or I begin to read it and realize I don't like it. And I am stuck with all these books, many books that I don't read, I don't like, and that I end up regretting spending the money on. And so I think that's something that perhaps needs to change with my book buying habits. Perhaps I do need to go more of the route of creating a written to buy list, and then at the end or the beginning of each month, looking at that list, assessing what on that list I still want to read, and then going to seek out maybe 2 or 3 books from that list that will actually be valued additions to my book collection and to my library. Just a thought here. Who knows? I may discard this thought altogether and just go with my impulses, as I often do.